Hi everyone, and welcome to my ICSE Journal First talk. This paper is titled An Empirical Study on Release Note Patterns of Popular Apps in the Google Play Store, and it is published under EMSE in spring of 2022. My name is Aiden Young, and I am a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, where my research is focused on software engineering and machine learning. I want to thank you for being here, watching my presentation, and I also want to thank my collaborators and mentors, Safwat Hassan at Thompson Rivers University, Ying Zhu at Queen's University, and Ahmed E. Hassan at Queen's University. The main motivation behind this work is that developers on app stores write a release note for every update of their app. But prior to this work, and to the best of our knowledge, no one has done an empirical and longitudinal study on release notes. So what are release notes? Release notes describe new features and fixes in an app's update. Here is an example of a release note from a popular app that I use on a daily basis, Duolingo. Duolingo is a Pittsburgh native company that helps people learn new languages. In their release note here, Duolingo developers describe a new feature, which is a language tip icon. At first glance, this seems like a descriptive and well-written release note. But what we don't know is that this release note might not have been updated from its previous one, or if this release note even adequately describes the most current release at all. And we can see from a corresponding user review that this release note does not provide all of the details of an app update. One thing that they missed that the user was not happy about is the fingerprint login setup. So from this example, we see that release notes are often imperfect and users sometimes complain about them. But now we want to ask, do developers care about release note complaints? And if they do, how do they address them? So as I dig around to answer the previous question, I come across a case where developers actually use a release note to directly answer user concerns. Another app that I sometimes use is the Staples Shopping app, which I noticed has recently been seeing a decline in user ratings. I was curious to see why that was the case. So I found a particular negative user review for a release. This user is not very happy about their rewards section and say they might even switch apps and use a different platform. And so I observed in the very next Staples release that the release note talks about the complaint, and another developer responds to the user shortly after, asking them to update the app. So in this example, we see that developers are using release notes as more than just an update placeholder, and they're using it to respond to users and help them write better responses that address user concerns. So at this point, I can see that both users and developers do care about release notes, but these are specific examples that I found. I want to know if, in a general sense, developers truly do care. And to do that, we want to ask using a bigger scale survey. So we sent out survey invitations on multiple discussion platforms for app developers and asked them questions about how they write release notes and if they care about release notes. So for example, we created posts on app developer subreddits or on a QA site called fdroid.org. And in total, we got 102 developer responses. So we first want to see some of the backgrounds of the survey developers. We find a variety of specific roles that they perform within their organization, such as project management, testing and QA, or configuration management. We see that release notes are written by all types of developers in a team. Even more specifically, we see that 15% of the survey developers say that they work mostly on release management. So keeping release notes up to date is a very important aspect of their job. So we know that at least 15% of our survey developers do care about release note writing. But how do they care about them? How do they leverage them? And what about the rest of these developers? So when asked if they update their release notes, we see that 67% of them say that they try to update at every release. 78% of the surveyed responses say that they would like a tool to help them generate release notes automatically. 83% of the responses think that release notes can directly respond to users. And the most important part is that 90% of the developers say that release notes are important for notifying the user base about recent updates to their app, where only 1% think that release notes are not useful for updating their user base. So now that we have some survey results that seem promising and seems to motivate our research, we want to see if data from the top 2,000 apps on the Google Play Store support the survey developers' responses. We also want to use the data available from existing apps to see if we can identify if different types of patterns can be correlated to different types of app behaviors. So to do this, we try to collect data from the Google Play Store. We use release notes, user reviews, and developer responses to those user reviews on the top 2,232 apps on the Google Play Store in the span of 3 years, which is between April 2016 to April 2019. All in all, we collected 70,000 release notes, 67 million user reviews, and 2.9 million developer responses to those user reviews. With our data, we try to ask and answer 3 research questions. The first research question is, we want to know if apps write release notes under certain patterns. As a start to the possible types of patterns, we look at how often release notes are updated and how much content they contain when they are updated. For RQ2, we want to ask if apps that follow certain patterns that we identified previously will show certain app characteristics. For example, a characteristic could be the size of an app, or the frequency of an update, or the amount of user reviews that are positive versus the amount of user reviews that are negative. Finally, assuming that we can identify patterns and those patterns do correlate with app characteristics, we try to figure out if apps ever change their release note patterns and if that change is related to any other app characteristic changes as well. So to answer our first research question, we first have to measure some features from release notes to use them and find patterns. So we first measure the updatability of every release note, which we use cosine similarity from every release note to all of its prior release note successors. We then measure how much content the release note contains by the string length of a release note. So at the end of that, we find 6 different release note patterns based on those features, which we use as string length of release note and cosine similarity. For example, the first pattern we find is short, non-updating, and steady, which has short and always low updating release notes. And we say steady because the updatability does not change over time. These types of release notes will often say something like bug fixes or minor improvements. Of our data set, we find that 439 of the apps exhibit these types of release notes. Another example is pattern 2, which is also short release notes, but they are always updating. That means that at every single release, they say something about their update that is different than their previous releases. So we only find 111 apps that follow this type of pattern. But we also find a different type of pattern, which is apps in pattern 3 and pattern 6. And these apps don't change their release notes until a major release or an emergency release. We sometimes see apps that have much more descriptive release notes when the app undergoes a big change. For example, pattern 6 that have long release notes and only update their release notes at a major release. Of this type, we find 288 apps within our dataset. So now that we have identified some patterns, we want to see if these patterns have anything to do with other app characteristics. So think back to the Staples app example. I want to see if it is just that one user that really didn't like the Staples release note and giving a negative review, or maybe that user is complaining about something inherent with the app, which is correlated to the way that developers write release notes for Staples. So to answer that question, we use statistical and machine learning tools to find characteristics of apps that can correlate with any of our identified release note patterns. So we build 6 logistic regression models on each of the 6 patterns and try to observe if certain app attributes are correlated with release note patterns. For one example is that we find that apps that write short and non-updating release notes, or pattern 1, often include a lot of bug words and very rarely use emergency keywords. And by that, I mean that they will often say things like bug fixes or identified bugs, but they won't really say, here's a big emergency fix for this issue. So after building the 6 models on the 6 identified patterns, we find some interesting results for each pattern. Specifically, we find that apps in pattern 6 that have long and rising updatability release notes tend to have higher user response rate. Apps in pattern 5 that have long and always updating release notes have higher perceived quality releases compared to other apps. So now that we have a sense of the major release note patterns and how they are related to app features, but since developers and app teams change due to various reasons, we can't assume that they always write release notes the same way as well. So next we try to see what is correlated with a shift in release notes. We want to formalize and learn about the apps that show a shift in these release notes. So we try to study how much a release note pattern changes based on a time series analysis. For each clustering metric, which is the length and updatability of each release note, if an app shows a statistically significant change in relation to time, we call the app non-stationary and hence a shifting pattern. So using this approach, we find 54 apps that show a shifting release note pattern. And of these 54 apps, the most important and thing that we noticed is that a vast majority, 92% of them, are either from short to long or non-updating to updating release notes. As you can see from the figure on the right, 16 of the 54 shifting apps go from using short non-updating release notes to long and updating release notes, or pattern 1 to pattern 5. So for all of the 54 apps that show a pattern shift, we read the release notes manually before and after its shift to see why the release notes are different. We saw that some shifts are because of apps that need to teach users how to use a new feature, or sometimes they need to address a particularly negative user feedback, talk about a big fix or UI changes that might confuse users, or sometimes they change patterns because Google Play Store has a service update, so they have to mention it in all subsequent release notes. And some of the reasons we identified are just really fun. Sometimes devs include a happy holiday release note, such as it's Christmas time, and so we have made additional changes, and here they are. Or they just make jokes about their new updates, such as we squashed some pesky bugs, or we have killed some feature crashes for you. So one important finding as well is that of all of the different types of shifts, we found that pattern 1, short non-updating, to pattern 5 shifts, which are long and updating release notes, 94% of them show a higher average rating after the shift. And so we assume that there is something going on when developers are writing better and more informative release notes and a higher app rating and have higher app quality at the end. To summarize this work, we found that release notes are imperfect and users often write negative reviews because of them. We use a developer survey study as well as quantitative study on 3 years of Google Play Store data to find out how release notes are written and how they can be improved. To the best of our knowledge, our work is the first to include both a qualitative study and a longitudinal study on such a large data set of release notes. Our main contributions are the 6 identified release note patterns, the classification model that identified app characteristics correlated to these patterns. And in particular, we found that apps that write long, updating, and informative release notes often have higher perceived releases. And when apps shift from writing non-informative to very informative in release notes, we see that apps have a higher rating evolvement as well. And that concludes my talk. Thank you for watching and have a good rest of your day.